Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy, and continue looking at analyzing African philosophy, our series with a focus on positions of philosophy from Africa, both in modern day and pre-colonial and pre-modern Africa. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is Bantu philosophy. So we travel next to Central Africa, specifically the Congo, where one of the first books of what might be considered ethnophilosophy was written by a Belgian missionary named Placide Tempels in 1945, entitled Bantu Philosophy. If you're curious as to what ethnophilosophy is, check out my video on ethnophilosophy as part of this series. Bantu is a language group which stretches all the way from the Sawa-Bantu languages in southern Cameroon to Xhosa in South Africa to Swahili in the African Great Lakes region. In terms of large groups of languages, it covers most of the southern part of Africa, whereas parts of West Africa and parts of kind of Northeast Africa around the Horn of Africa have a bit more diverse and separate groups of languages. Broadly, Bantu languages cover a lot of parts of Africa, in South and Central Africa. So Tempels' work can be viewed as a response to the claims of many famous philosophers, including Kant, Hume, and Hegel, and many others that you will find in philosophy classes, that African people were incapable of rational thought and philosophy, and therefore colonialism and racial hierarchies were justified. In fact, if you look into the works of Kant and Hume, you can find references to and even outlinings of racial hierarchies and arguments for them, frequently based in this idea that African people do not have rationality or philosophy, and therefore Europeans have the right to come in and enslave them and all sorts of other things. Tempels argued that, in fact, there was an underlying Bantu philosophy shared by African people, especially from that large region of Central and Southern Africa. However, it had not been consciously expressed in the methods of modern Western philosophy, giving rise to the need for his ethnophilosophical text, Bantu Philosophy, to document and codify these beliefs. Just a note here, the views of Kant, Hume, and Hegel are very racist, and it's frightening when you look at a lot of kind of modern era philosophers. When I say modern, I mean the time period broadly spanning from Descartes to Kant. Those philosophers' views on race are frightening by today's standards. Tempels' work is meeting a very low bar, but it is objecting to and responding to those racial views expressed by those philosophers. So it's worthy of note that while Tempels was revolutionary in the West for the time, arguing that African people did have a real philosophy, which is a low bar by today's standards, he did claim that it required the work of Western-trained ethnophilosophers to draw out and categorize it. Perhaps it was a progressive position in the 40s, but it's still quite problematic. Regardless, Tempels' claim that Africans did in fact have philosophy and rationality was the beginning of the end for the prevalence of theories of racial hierarchy in philosophy and their use in the justifications of colonialism. So, as much as you say, wow, Tempels, you did not go nearly far enough, this was one of the works that started that conversation around, wow, we have some really problematic racial views in the world of philosophy. The actual philosophy presented by Tempels has its share of detractors. It's basically amounted to an ontology based not in being, but in life force. Basically saying that something has being not because it's physical or it exists, but because it has some kind of force or a life force, and that even inanimate objects have this thing. The force is present in everything, but it's weaker in some things and stronger in others, and it has different types, and those types make up what kind of thing you are, and the strength of the force gives you kind of your power or ability to act on other things. All such forces exist in a hierarchy with God or a supreme force at the top. Each individual instance of a force has a type and intensity. That intensity can be changed. It can be either strengthened or weakened. Causal actions occur when a stronger force acts upon a weaker force, a goat eating grass, a human killing a goat, an act of God, or a stronger human killing a human, and so on and so forth. This incorporates traditional cultural ideas of all objects having kind of spirits or some kind of life force, which are common to many African cultures and often referred to broadly as animism. Now, reaction to this philosophy can be broadly placed into three categories, all of which we're going to look at here. The first is the initial category that Tempels was reacting to. This group claims that ethnophilosophy was not real philosophy. This is the Kants, the Humes of the world. They argue that these cultural beliefs are not the same kind of thing that is meant by philosophy, and therefore Africans lacked pre-modern philosophy. Though the latter discovered works of Zara Yacob, Walde Hewat show otherwise. And we're going to take a look at those written works from the 1600s in the next video. But setting those aside, this view is that ethnophilosophy is nonsense and therefore we can still justify this kind of racial and colonial machine. This debate was playing out during the period of history in which many African countries were fighting for their independence from colonization. So the results of this seemingly esoteric philosophical debate about ontology did have real consequences. If Tempels was right and Africans have the ability to philosophize and reason, then the justification for racial hierarchies of Kant and Hume, and therefore colonization, would fall apart. And because most people came around to believing that, yeah, Tempels is right, those racial hierarchies did fall apart. Colonialism ended, and we had the civil rights movement in the United States and all sorts of other things that came out of this. Now, that's not to say that Tempels was the only one that was doing this and he caused all of this to happen, but at least within the world of philosophy, talking about this, Tempels' work on Bantu philosophy was one of the first kind of key dominoes in a chain that set off this discussion of saying, wow, these views need updating. Without these racial justifications, the evils of colonialism, of one rational group of people oppressing another, were laid bare for all to see. So setting aside such racist views, there were still a range of reactions to Tempels' work within the up-and-coming community of African philosophers. So that's not to say that there aren't, unfortunately, people that probably hold those views still today, but there's a lot of really strong objections to them, particularly in the fact that we do have written Ethiopian philosophy from the 1600s that arguably expresses some of the ideas of kind of Kant and Hume and Mill and others before they did, and Locke before they did. And so the idea that there is no African philosophy, even if you set aside ethnophilosophy, really falls apart when you look at that. And we're going to check those out in the next video. But, so setting aside those views, because I think we have some strong reasons to object to them, both from the moral standpoint of racism, but also from the standpoint of we have some evidence to go against them. There are also some other reactions to Tempels' philosophy, and a clear example of this can be found in the differing reactions to Tempels' work by two of the founders of the Negritude Movement, a philosophy deserving of its own video at some point in the future. And those two different people that were reacting to it were Léopold Sédar Senghor and Aimé Césaire. Now, Senghor, who's from Senegal, which, if you're bad at geography, is outside of kind of that region of kind of Bantu languages and that area. It's as far west as you can go in Africa. Was constructing a very similar African ontology, which he actually presented in an essay before Tempels' book was published in 1939. And it categorized a very similar story about kind of life forces and describing kind of these animist traditions. And so when he encountered Tempels' work, he said, wow, this is evidence that there is a common African experience, that there is a common kind of cultural philosophy about the way the world works. He argued that Tempels' work was justification for the work that he was doing, and evidence of that shared African experience and ontology, even beyond just the Bantu kind of language grouping or broad ethnic grouping, though there are a lot of ethnicities within that. And so Senghor said that this is a justification for the work I'm doing in the realm of ethnophilosophy, that someone else in another part of Africa has done this work and has said, look at the comparisons we can find, and it's just further justification and proof of these kinds of things. So he was in favor of both the general practice of ethnophilosophy and the specific conclusions of Tempels, because they ended up aligning surprisingly well with his own philosophy. Now, Césaire, on the other hand, rejected Tempels' specific conclusions as a further method for a justification of colonization. Basically, if the world was categorized into stronger and weaker forces, and the stronger forces were able to act on the weaker forces, clearly the colonists were the stronger force, which Tempels arguably alludes to when he's describing how Africans viewed the colonists frequently as much stronger than them and talking a lot more about God and having a closer connection to God. And therefore, those colonists were better and able to act on the colonized. While Senghor saw the works as an honest attempt to make the case for an African philosophy in line with traditional beliefs, Césaire viewed it as a way to reform but still perpetuate colonialism. Basically, Césaire's objection here is that this is just a way to try to explain the rationale for colonialism in a way that's in line with traditional African beliefs. And what all you're really doing, Tempels, is trying to insinuate your subtle rationale for racial hierarchies in the form of something that looks like a justification for African philosophy, and saying, well, look, African philosophy has this idea of a hierarchy, and we have these ideas of racial hierarchies. Maybe that's what they were talking about. Maybe Africans actually did believe those things as well. So Césaire viewed it as a way to kind of reform and continue colonialism while addressing some of the kind of easy-to-hit objections, and therefore perpetuate the existence of colonialism by digging it deeper into the ideas of many Africans. So now, few today would make the claim that Africans are not rational or incapable of philosophy, not only because it would be considered racist, but because many amazing post-colonial African philosophers have proved them wrong, and because of the pre-colonial written African philosophy record that has been discovered. So there's a lot of reasons that the claim that Tempels was objecting to has been completely dismissed by philosophy. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways we can object to Tempels' philosophy or concerns we might have. One might be concerned with the method for attacking the justification for colonialism. Even if there was no evidence for African philosophy, it does not seem to follow that therefore Africans are deserving of fewer rights or are a lesser people, as was argued in many of the works. A more charitable interpretation of this position might be that it is the ability to be rational or do philosophy, which arguably all humans have, regardless of ethnicity or cultural history, that provides moral status, not a written history of it. Though there are clearly some edge cases, such as infants, where if you say that the only way you can have moral status is to have rationality, and you say, oh, an infant doesn't have rationality, so maybe it doesn't have moral status, setting aside those edge cases, it seems that this is a far better way to provide people with moral status, of saying that you as a human have the ability to be rational, whether your culture has a history of it or not, and therefore you have basic rights like not being sold into slavery or not being oppressed. And so you might say, well, we don't need to show that there was African philosophy to think that colonialization was wrong. That said, it's understandable why Tempels needed to make the argument that he did in the context he was living in that was arguably much more racist in our context today. Another concern might come in the general critiques of ethnophilosophy we examined earlier. If one asserts that the ability to be rational or do philosophy is what's required for moral status, not some cultural history of philosophizing, then there's no moral need to attempt to reconstruct philosophical positions out of cultural beliefs. This view might argue that we should simply pay attention to what people from that culture are arguing for now, which we would consider philosophy, instead of trying to construct positions out of anthropological studies. And I think this might be the kind of attack that Césaire would bring against Tempels' work, and against the process of ethnophilosophy, saying that listen to the Africans that are actually talking right now. Don't go listening to a European that's trying to reinterpret African cultural beliefs to find some eventual justification for colonization. The response to that, of course, might be something along the lines of, well, current African philosophers are probably operating within a realm or because of their history or their culture, so it makes sense to understand their culture and to study that culture and to study why those beliefs existed and where those beliefs came from, in the same way that we might study Aristotle or Plato to understand the works of Descartes or Kant. And so there may be an argument and a back and forth to happen there around whether or not ethnophilosophy as a discipline still has a place. But I think it's still, at the very least, interesting to talk about and interesting to study, even if you think that ethnophilosophy isn't fully philosophy. Check out my video on ethnophilosophy for more on those kinds of arguments. In terms of specific objections to Bantu philosophy's ontology, one might claim that there are instances of weaker forces actually acting on stronger forces, and that it's not simply the strength of force of something that demonstrates whether it has a causal effect on something else, that boundaries of things are really poorly defined, so it's difficult to determine what constitutes, say, a place or an object and what its force is, kind of persistence problems, just identity problems. Additionally, one might present a materialistic or atheistic argument for principles of science that govern causality, or against the existence of a supreme force or God. In line with this, while these positions have outlined what they believe, it's difficult to see what arguments can be offered to defend why they believe those things, particularly in the face of scientific explanations for phenomena. And this is a common charge leveled against ethnophilosophy, that while ethnophilosophy often succeeds at determining what a culture believes, it doesn't necessarily succeed at providing a convincing argument for it. But things like scientific explanations for phenomena can be leveled just as easily against a wide range of older philosophies, including the works of Aristotle, to be sure, and Thomas Aquinas and the like. So this may be a broad critique of this position, but it's a broad critique of any position that's older than a certain point in time. So that was Bantu philosophy. Next up, we are going to be looking at Ethiopian philosophy, which is some of the few, if not only, written record of philosophy from sub-Saharan Africa before kind of colonization and the modern period. It's very fascinating, very interesting. It's going to be a cool video. What do you think about Bantu philosophy and the work of Tempels? Do you think that he was a revolutionary that set off this big discussion, or do you think that he really didn't go far enough? Do you think that ethnophilosophy is something we should still be doing, or should we just be worrying about what current African philosophers are saying? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. After Ethiopian philosophy, we'll take a look at Pan-Africanism. Thank you so much for watching this series on African philosophy. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.